John Birch Society presents a videotaped lecture by William Norman Grigg, based on his latest book, Freedom on the Altar, The UN's Crusade Against God and Family. Mr. Grigg is a senior editor of the New American Magazine and a member of the staff of the John Birch Society. He has written extensively on the growing assault by government, including the United Nations, upon the family and traditional religion. As part of his research, Mr. Grigg attended the UN summits in Cairo and Copenhagen. He has since appeared as a guest on numerous radio and television programs to warn Americans regarding the growing threat to freedom posed by the United Nations.
Thank you very much. Now, is the United Nations the institution upon which the world's future depends, or is it an instrument of an embryonic socialist tyranny? There are a few questions that are more important for those who understand and cherish freedom. And in this 50th anniversary year of the United Nations, many of the world's most powerful and influential leaders are urging the people of the world to support measures which would give the United Nations every necessary attribute of a fully functioning world government. This is not a new idea. For over 250 years, there have been elites who have pursued the vision of a world under the direction of an elite group which would regiment our lives and seek to dictate to us the way in which we will live. This was the vision we saw in the French Revolution. It is the vision we saw in the Russian Revolution in 1917. And now the United Nations is the inheritor of this objective. And these ideas have been reiterated in this new book, Our Global Neighborhood, which is a recent report composed by the Commission on Global Governance, which is an organization which was founded with the blessing of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations. This report recommends that the UN be given the power to impose taxes, that it be equipped with a battle-ready military under its exclusive control, and that it give the World Court compulsory jurisdiction over individuals. They also urge that the United Nations support the creation of a world central bank, and that they campaign to disarm the entire world, including the civilian population. Now, once again, none of these recommendations are new. And most of them have been made at some point during the last 50 years by the United Nations and by the United States government. However, what is new is the brazenness with which the UN and its supporters have called for the creation of a fully functioning world government under the United Nations administration. Now, what are the implications of such a development for you and your families? To answer this question, it must first be understood that the United Nations embodies not only a political philosophy, but a religious vision as well. That political philosophy is globalism, the concept that human evolution will be consummated in the development of a global government based on socialist principles. Now, this is the malignant objective which we find within the UN's assurances that the organization seeks universal peace. The most candid admission of this often concealed objective was made in 1970 by then UN Secretary General U Thant. He praised Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet government, as an apostle of world peace, whose ideas, quote, have had a profound influence on the course of contemporary history, a profound and bloody influence on the course of contemporary history, I might add. Now, according to U Thant, quote, Lenin's ideals of peace and peaceful coexistence among states are in line with the aims of the UN Charter. Like every other UN Secretary General, U Thant was a socialist, and he surely understood that Lenin's concept of peaceful coexistence did not embrace the sovereignty of nations and individual rights, but rather the triumph of socialism. It is this vision of peace, that is the tranquility of servitude, not the triumph of freedom, which inspires the United Nations efforts. Now, the United Nations religious vision could be summarized as the idea of the state as God, that is, the state as the creator of our rights, and the provider of all our material benefits, and the source of our literal salvation. And perhaps the most detailed exposition of this perspective, this religious perspective, was offered by former Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller, whose New Age scribblings are regarded as something akin to sacred scripture by many within the United Nations system. Mueller has written that, quote, I have come to believe that our future, peace, justice, and fulfillment, happiness, and harmony on this planet will not depend on world government, but on divine or cosmic government. And the seat of this divine government, according to Robert Mueller, would be the UN. Mueller has written that the organization represents what he calls the body of Christ. And he has insisted that, quote, if Christ came back to earth, his first visit would be to the United Nations to see if his dream of human oneness and brotherhood had come true. Now, is Christ's teachings about human oneness and brotherhood in any way compatible with Lenin's vision of human oneness? Now, it would have to be if Mueller's statement were correct. And traditional Christians know better than that. Now, one symbolic manifestation of the UN's vision of cosmic government can be found in the meditation room of the United Nations, which is depicted on the cover of my book. This room was designed in 1952 by then Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish socialist and homosexual, and it has been maintained by an organization called the Lucis Trust. It was under Hammarskjöld's leadership, incidentally, that the UN conducted its murderous suppression of the province of Katanga in the former Belgian Congo in the early 1960s. When Katanga sought to obtain its independence from the communist rule of Congolese dictator Patrice Lumumba, the United Nations so-called peacekeeping troops conducted a campaign of slaughter, pillage, and rape against the province.
UN troops advancing from all sides systematically wipe out all resistance pockets, and in the process machine guns and bazooka civilian cars trying to escape from the city, killing many innocent civilians running for their lives to find cover from UN fire. This truck, which had made an attempt to carry refugees, among them women and children, out of Elizabethville, was deliberately bazookaed by UN Ethiopian troops. Many of the slain men and women were civilians who bore no arms. A sworn statement by 46 doctors at the scene characterizes as murder the action of UN troops in machine gunning civilians and Red Cross ambulances.
The peacekeeping operation conducted against the Congo, by the way, is still proudly listed as among the UN's most conspicuous successes, and Dag Hammarskjöld is elevated by the United Nations as the very model of an effective Secretary General. The massacre of the Congo was what we could consider to be a particularly vigorous application of the UN's vision of world brotherhood. The THE.VHS Trust, which has helped to maintain the meditation room, is an outgrowth of a previous organization called the Lucifer Publishing Company. That publishing company was itself a descendant of the Theosophical Society. The objective of the Theosophical Society, which was founded in the late 19th century, was to destroy monotheistic faith, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and replace it with the new world religion under which humanity would be directed by leaders who are attuned to an unseen brotherhood of ascended masters who supposedly preside over human evolution. In her book, The Secret Doctrine, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Russian mystic who was the founder of the Theosophical Society, identified these so-called Lords of Wisdom as none other than Satan and his host. Now, the Lucis Trust, which is the vessel of Blavatsky's satanic religion, helped create not only the meditation room of the United Nations, but also the UN's so-called Temple of Understanding. Lucis eagerly distributes Robert Mueller's writings as well, and helps to organize religious support for the UN's initiatives, and they are a conspicuous presence at every United Nations World Summit. Now, Mueller has called for what he refers to as an alliance between all major religions and the UN, and since 1991, the UN has undertaken several significant steps toward the formal creation of this envisioned religious alliance. During a 1991 Paris meeting of the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization, also known as UNESCO, globalist theologian Hans Kung offered to compose on the UN's behalf what was referred to as the religious equivalent of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UN Charter, a global ethic document which would contain a binding summary of rights and responsibilities for religious people all around the world. The completed document was presented to the 1993 Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and it was referred to in that meeting as, quote, an alternative framework for religion to which people would be held accountable. Now, incidentally, The first Parliament of World Religions in 1893, which was also held in Chicago, offered Blavatsky's Theosophical Society its first significant access to American culture. And the 1993 Parliament was hailed by contemporary theosophists as the herald of a great theosophical revival. Now, the text of the Declaration of a Global Ethic declares that the document represents, quote, an irrevocable, unconditional norm for all areas of life, for families and communities, for races, nations, and religions. The acceptance of this universal norm, according to the Global Ethic document, will be a minimum requirement to be considered authentically human in the 21st century. Now, significantly, the word God is not found anywhere in this document, and the commandments contained therein issue from individuals who presume to speak on behalf of a different deity, namely the sacred earth, or Gaia, our Earth Mother. Apparently, authentic humans will have no use for property rights in the 21st century. The Global Ethic states that, quote, no one has the right to use her or his possessions without concern for the needs of society and Earth. Individualism, as well, is condemned as a sin. The document asserts that, quote, self-determination and self-realization are legitimate as long as they are not separated from human self-responsibility and global responsibility, that is, responsibility for fellow humans and for the planet Earth. The Global Ethic Declaration commands journalists, political officials, and religious leaders to promote this Ghazi collectivism as a moral imperative for everybody on the planet Earth. Now, what impact will this UNESCO-supported and UN-promoted global ethic have on practitioners of traditional biblical religion? Well, consider this statement from Hans Kung, who was the author of the document. In 1991, he wrote, quote, any form of church conservatism is to be rejected. To put it bluntly, no repressive or regressive religion, whether Christian, Islamic, Jewish, or of whatever provenance, has a long-term future. In other words, traditional monotheistic faiths must now yield before the imperatives of the global ethic, according to Kung and his comrades. And incidentally, the phrase authentically human should send a chill through anybody who was acquainted with the history of this bloody century, what has been the common fate of those who have been designated as something other than authentically human. We have seen what has happened to such people in the killing fields of Cambodia and in the Soviet Revolution and in the chambers of Auschwitz. This is the same philosophy once again. The keynote address of the 1993 Parliament of World Religions was given by Gerald Barney of the Millennium Institute. He is a former program director for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the primary author of the Global 2000 report for the Carter administration. Mr. Barney was the chief organizer of the Religious Parliament, and his revised edition of the Global 2000 report, called Global 2000 Revisited, was the primary text for the 1993 Parliament of World Religions. Barney told the assembled religious leaders that, quote, an internationally famous, highly influential author on sustainable development, that is, environmentalism, told me bluntly, religion must die. It is the fundamental cause of virtually all social, economic, and ecological problems and much of the violence in the world. The only alternative to the destruction of religion, Barney told the assembled religious leaders, is the creation of an ecologically correct universal religion, one which would sustain the political and social objectives identified by the United Nations, particularly with respect to population control. This point has also been made by Maurice Strong, who is a Canadian industrial mogul and New Age adept, who served as the Secretary General of the United Nations 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. At that meeting, the United Nations created a mammoth blueprint for ecologically correct world government called Agenda 21, whose directives, according to Agenda 21, quote, are to be implemented by every person on Earth. Once again, this is depicted by the United Nations as something in the nature of a religious obligation. At the Rio Earth Summit, Maurice Strong declared that, quote, the responsibility of each human being today is to choose between the force of darkness and the force of light. We must therefore transform our attitudes and values and adopt a renewed respect for the superior laws of divine nature. Maurice Strong is presently collaborating with former Soviet dictator Mikhail Gorbachev in the creation of an Earth Charter, a definitive statement of these so-called laws of divine nature. Now, according to Gorbachev, the Earth Charter will be, quote, a 10 commandments for the environment, something that no one will be allowed to violate. Now, this is not the language of biblical morality. Rather, these are the cadences of totalitarian dictatorship. And that dictatorship will descend upon a prostrate and defenseless world should the empowerment of the United Nations continue. It is important to remember that the laws of divine nature, as interpreted by the UN, would have jurisdiction within the home, particularly in matters of population control. Under the UN's concept of what they call sustainable development, the human population is a resource to be managed by global supervisors. To understand how sustainable development works in practice, all one needs to do is to examine the case of communist China, which has enacted a policy forbidding couples to have more than one child without special permission from the government, and to have no more than 2 children in any case. The Chinese population program includes compulsory abortion, infanticide, and sterilization, and a steeply escalating scale of punishments for couples who have unauthorized children. Now, all of these programs are generously underwritten by the United Nations through its Fund for Population Activities, UNICEF, the UN Development Fund, and allied organizations such as the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Furthermore, this hideous program received an award from the United Nations Population Fund in 1983 and was commended by then Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar as an example for the entire world. Now, although the Chinese regime's policies have inflicted unimaginable horrors upon women, the UN, in its wisdom, has chosen Beijing as the site of its 1995 World Conference on Women's Rights. Now, at the 1994 Population Control Conference in Cairo, the UN set forth the 20-year plan to stabilize the world's population, a terrifying prospect given the body's affinity for coercive population control. How would this stabilization be achieved? According to Jacques Cousteau, in remarks published in the UNESCO Courier, a UN publication, quote, in order to stabilize world population, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. It is a horrible thing to say, writes Cousteau, but it's just as bad not to say it. Now, the key to the imposition of radical population control policies is the denial of parental rights and the substitution of the paternalism of the state. If children are the property of the state can regulate the number of children it permits to be born. This is the assumption which the UN has supported and subsidized in China and elsewhere, and it is also found in the proposal that parents be required to obtain a license from the state in order to enjoy the privilege of having children. This book, Licensing Parents, Can We Prevent Child Abuse and Neglect, was published in late 1994 by Dr. Jack Westman, a noted and influential children's rights activist. Now, according to Dr. Westman and the experts that he quotes, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child makes government, and not the parents, the primary custodian of the rights and interests of children. This interpretation, by the way, was confirmed to me in an interview I had with Dr. Richard Jolly, who at the time was the acting head of UNICEF. Once again, if the state is the primary custodian of children, why couldn't it require parents to obtain a license before they are permitted to have children? And furthermore, why couldn't the state seize children from parents it decides are unqualified? Article 9 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as summarized by the United Nations, states, quote, the child has a right to live with his or her parents unless this is deemed to be incompatible with the child's best interests. This is to say that under the terms of the convention, the state, which would define the best interests of children, could seize children from parents at whim. What might America look like if we were to ratify the convention and restructure our society accordingly? One possible future has been described by children's rights activist David Lycan of the University of Minnesota, who is a supporter of parental licensing and has created a blueprint for parental licensing. According to a sympathetic newspaper account of Lycan's proposal, we can find this scenario. Quote, under Lycan's system, if children were born to unlicensed parents, the state would intervene immediately, Licenses would be checked in hospital maternity wards. Unlicensed parents would lose their children permanently. Adoptions would be final and irreversible. Furthermore, according to Lycan himself, quote, repeat offenders might be required to submit to an implant of Norplant as a way to keep them from having another baby for 5 years. In other words, government sterilization as we see in communist China. For more than a quarter of a century, population control advocates have urged the UN and national governments to impose parental licensing programs for the purpose of rationing the so-called privilege of having children. This roster of misanthropes includes anti-natalist writers Paul Ehrlich, Edgar Chastain, and Garrett Hardin, Frederick Jaffe of the Planned Parenthood Federation, Bernard Berelson of the Population Council, World Bank advisor Norman Myers, Kenneth Boulding, an economist who was an advisor to the League of Nations, and Sir Roy Calm, a noted British surgeon and supposed humanitarian. All these individuals have endorsed compulsory abortion and sterilization and other repellent measures to ensure parental compliance with parental licensing programs. And as we have seen once again, all of these concepts have been implemented with the support of the United Nations in communist China. Once again, if children are a resource to be managed by the almighty state, as the UN asserts, then parenthood is a privilege which the state can and must regulate. As Garrett Hardin correctly observes, quote, if parenthood is a right, then population control is impossible. This is one of the most important reasons why the UN works diligently to subvert the independence of families and to convince the public that parenthood is a state-created privilege. As we noted at the beginning of our presentation, the UN's designs are rooted in a religious vision of the global state as God, as the global state, the creator of our rights and the provider of our material benefits. From the American perspective, by way of contrast, individuals receive their rights not from the state, but from our creator, God. And the state was created by man to protect God-given individual rights and to serve no other function. The UN's vision dictates that the powers of the state are unlimited and that individual rights are enumerated by the all-powerful state and subject to revocation without notice by the state. The American vision, by way of contrast, once again, is that the powers of the state are few and defined and that government is accountable to individuals for its actions. There can be no compromise between these contending visions, and the stakes in the struggle are nothing less than the happiness, prosperity, and freedom of you and your families, and the fate of human freedom on this planet. Fortunately, we have within our reach the means to defeat the United Nations and its masters and to recover our freedoms. To learn more about the ways in which you can help get us out of the United Nations and restore our constitutional republic, I humbly suggest that you contact the John Birch Society, which for more than 35 years has been a leader in this struggle. Thank you very much.